Yeah.
Alrighty, so that's gonna happen, and we're gonna talk mostly about your newest book, is if that's good with you, Making China Modern. Is that okay?
Please. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
All right, we're gonna hit record in three, two. Welcome to another episode of Million Dollar Stories, where we get to interview authors from all over the world. I love talking to authors because they do a lot of research. They have their own abilities to get down and dirty, get the insight that maybe many people seek, but they also have the courage to take their thoughts, their stories, their lessons, put it down in a book and share it with the many, ultimately changing their legacy and their destiny in the process. And if you're out there, I recommend you write a book, the clarity that comes with it, but also the opportunities, such as getting on podcasts that it grants you, is absolutely amazing. So if you want to write a book, check out dreamstarterspublishing.com. We can help you out with wherever you're at in the process. And if you have a book that's already done, you want to generate leads with it for your business, check out bookmarketingcrm.com. Now, as you know, when you listen to this podcast, we talk a lot about what's happening in the world because you have to be aware of it. You have to be able to look at this as like a chess game and maneuver and see what other countries are doing, other companies are doing. And the more astute you are, the better you're going to play this game of life. And that's why we're interviewing our next guest, who wrote a book called Making China Modern, from the great Xing to Xi Jinping. And I may be mispronouncing that, so I apologize. But I love learning about what's happening in China when it comes to the BRICS, when it comes to their social credit score. I mean, some things are scary, some things are definitely eye-opening. So I can't wait to talk to our next guest, who is a professor, but we will just call him Klaus Muhlhen. Thank you so much for being here, sir.
Well, my pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, let's start off number one, I guess, with your background. I mean, you have an extensive background. You're easy to find on Google. You have many speeches that are there. So if you can give us a quick little rundown on where you come from and what you were able to accomplish and why you wrote this book.
Well, I'm a German, and I started after graduating from high school. I started to learn Chinese because I became interested in the country. That was about 3 decades ago, and I was already convinced 3 decades ago that China is going to matter in the world. So my career is basically studying China, writing about China, and I've written a number of books. And the last one, Making China Modern, is really an attempt to sort of offer a more or less comprehensive picture of how China got to the point where it is now, a very powerful, a very advanced country. But it started from a very different point. It was one of the poorest countries just 4 decades ago.
Wow. Yeah. So I did a quick little glance at the history of it. I think you said, or when you talk about the beginning, whenever I was doing a little bit of research, the great Xing, and am I saying that right? It's spelled Qing in American. So
It's like Qing,
Jing.
the
Oh, Jing.
Qing
Okay,
dynasty.
good deal.
Yeah.
So I believe that was a dynasty that lasted, what is it, 300 years? Is that right?
Yes, a little more than 300 years. Yes, that's right.
300 years. It ended in 1911, and I believe that was the imperial system, imperialism, and
Mhm.
there was an overthrow. There was a revolution at that moment. So can you just start with there? And then, like I think you said, it was very, very poor until what, the 70s or 80s, and then everything just started to skyrocket with their maneuvers. So
Right.
what happened in 1911? Let's start
Yeah.
there.
So let me start a little earlier than
Okay.
1911. So the Qing Empire that you mentioned wasn't always poor. In fact, I think if we look at, let's say, around 1800 or 750, it was one of the leading empires in the world, and it was
Mm.
absolutely on the same level, let's say, like Great Britain, like France, like Germany, like Russia. So it was a very sophisticated empire, but it came into a period of crisis, and that crisis in the 19th century, which had many reasons, including, climate change, rebellion, economic crisis, and so on. And that ultimately led to the 1911 revolution. And the game of the revolution, or the goal of the revolution, was to create a modern China, a republican China, a China that would solve the problems, that crisis that the Qing dynasty had slipped into. So let me add one more sentence to that, because I think this age of grandeur, or this age of efflorescence, this age of greatness in the early Qing, that is very much on the mind of people today. And much of what we see in China is actually an effort to revive this old great, greatness of that empire.
Wow. So Xi Jinping is very much in alignment with their core values of that dynasty, basically.
Well, I wouldn't say the core values, but I would say that the idea that China used to be a very powerful country in the world, that is something that also the current government aims to revive. So China wants to get back to that place of centrality and eminence in the world.
Got it. Okay. So, I mean, they are number one. I think they're the world's manufacturing plant, from what I gathered, right? So, I think that started in the '80s, but they're making some waves everywhere, and they are an absolute powerhouse. So, I guess from 19. By the way, what was happening in 1911, 1912, 1913 in the world is insane. When you go back in time and look at that period, those 2, 3 years, it is so wild when it comes to the Federal Reserve, the beginning, the kickoff for the World War One. I mean, so much is happening. It's a very, very interesting time of history. So, 1911, you're saying that's when China maybe made a turn. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, they made a turn in a way. They overthrew the old, empire, the old imperial system, and they established, and that is really interesting, they established a republic. And this is actually the first republic in Asia.
Hmm.
And it was a democratic republic. The idea was to create a democratic society, a democratic state. But as we know, it was short-lived. And because it wasn't very stable, it didn't have a lot of support among the people and the elite. And therefore, after only 5 years in 1915, this new republic gets already overthrown again. And then there's a long period, we call it the warlord period, which is basically a civil war.
Got it. And so fast forward, I really want to get to, so before we run out of time, of what's happening nowadays, but go to, let's just say, the '70s or '80s, where it starts to just catch fire, whether it's property values or whether it's employment or just a workforce that is being built in China. And so in the '80s, pretty much everything that started coming across in the United States was made in China, right? So Japan also, Japan and China, both of them made big pushes right around the '70s. So what was happening there, and who is at who caused all that?
So from the revolution that we just talked about, 1911 to 1978, basically China isn't able to solve its problems. And so despite many, even radical efforts like at communism and people's communes and collectivization, none of that really works. And China is still very poor. Practically in 1978, it's just as poor as it was in 1911. So a
Wow.
whole century was basically wasted. And that's when a new leadership in China emerged, and they thought, okay, what do we have to do? And what they did is quite remarkable. They said we have to be pragmatic. First of all, we put economy first. So not politics anymore. We have emphasized politics and ideology for decades, but now we put the economy in the front seat. And also we are going to be pragmatic. As Deng Xiaoping famously said, he says, I don't care if it's a black cat or a white cat. I only want the cat to catch mice. So he was only looking at the result, right? He said it's not matter what color you have, it doesn't matter political colors. I just want to be successful. So in
Wow.
that sort of mentality, I think is at the root cause, is at the root of the Chinese development.
I'm telling you, America can learn quite a bit from them at this moment, right? Because it seems like politics has definitely taken the front seat in this administration rather than the economy. So, wow, there is something to be learned here.
There is something to be learned, and there's also something to be learned that if you put politics up front, that will create an unstable, situation. But anyway, for China, it worked really well because they were pragmatic and they experimented a lot. So I think that would be the second big factor that explains China's really, enormous rise, amazing rise since then. So that means they experimented. So, also Deng Xiaoping said to them, let's try different things. And then what works, that we will continue, and what doesn't work, that we just discard and leave behind.
And Xi Jinping, when did he take power?
In 19, not 19, I'm sorry, in 2012.
2012. Okay.
So
And
that's
so
about 12 years ago.
12 years ago. Okay. So I know that I was in college until 2007. I started a business. I knew nothing about what was happening in China. Maybe they talked about it on the TV. I didn't pay attention, but the only person I've ever heard is Xi Jinping. So what has he done? Is he um I would assume that he's just making this an absolute powerhouse, but he seems to rule with an iron fist, and he seems like a very, very well-educated, super smart guy who is shaking up a lot. So, what has he done, and is his goal to take China to becoming the number one power? And is he outspoken about that?
Right. No, he is very outspoken about that. And he always says that while he says we don't want to dominate the world, and he said we don't want to invade other countries, that's what Xi Jinping says. It is very clear that he also emphasizes that he wants China to be an equal in the world and to be a very respected and highly influential power. So Xi Jinping, I'm glad that you say that actually, because a lot of people, we tend to underestimate Chinese leaders. But he is a very smart guy. He's
Oh
a
yeah.
very hardworking guy. He just recently, I read a quote from him that he said, his wife had birthday and he had never celebrated a birthday with his wife because he's always working. So, and I believe that actually. I believe that actually. I think he is every day from morning to evening, he's working. He's a very hardworking guy. If you look at the schedule that he does, he is almost every week he visits some factory, some government agency, the army. He's always out there. So his schedule is brutal. And so we have to take him very seriously, absolutely. But your question was, where does he come from? And we know that his father was also an important politician in China. He was among the leaders. He was very reform-minded. He was a big helper for the reforms that we just discussed under Deng Xiaoping. So that is Xi Jinping's background. So he is sort of and let me then finish this here with one final remark. He's sort of a misery to us. So he comes from a reform-minded background, but he's also convinced that China needs to have a very strong government. And that's what you said was the iron fist, and I agree with that. It's a very strong government. He's deeply convinced that there's no space in China for chaos, for instability, or even for disobedience. So he wants his people to be, I wouldn't say to be, controlled in every aspect, but they have to behave according to the rules. They are not allowed to transgress the rules. So that is sort of his vision, a modern China, a successful China, but also a very orderly country where people stick to the rules and nobody sort of commits any crimes or breaks any rules.
Right, because of the quick trial, I believe they have, right? Quick trials. And so tell us a little bit about the issues that they face. I mean, I believe it's mounting debt. I think there's something that's happening there. I believe they're experiencing major inflation. I may be wrong about that, but they're facing some struggles. But crime is not one of them, and maybe there's a reason for it, and that is because the punishment is so extreme there. And I do believe we should adopt that here in the United States because you have what, 1.4 billion people over there, and crime is extremely low. So many issues, but they're doing something right. And then if you can kind of highlight what they're doing right and what they're doing wrong in your eyes.
So, one thing is clear. What you described is an absolutely true picture. So I can, when I'm in Shanghai or in any other Chinese city, and let's say I can go out at every time in the night, and you do not need to fear that something is going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
So it is totally safe at any time of the day. It's totally safe to be at any place in China. And that is something for it, because if I travel a lot and if I go to other countries, you have to be careful, where do you go, at what point to go. So it is an advantage, but it comes at a cost. You have quick trials, you have heavy punishments, and there's also always the risk, that goes too far. So, and sometimes in China, people then are afraid to speak up or are afraid because they are intimidated by the system. So I would say on one side, it's very stable, but it has a cost or a downside that
Hmm.
would be that it may be too draconian. But what are they do? So that's something they're doing right. Let me add a second thing that I think you as an American will probably be able to relate to. What they're also doing right is infrastructure. So they have built, and I mean that the infrastructure, public transport in the big cities, and think about Shanghai has 20 million, a population of 20 million. But you can go to any place in Shanghai by public transportation. It's fast, it's quick, it's convenient, it's affordable. And they have an excellent highway system, right? Very modernized highway system. I mean, if you compare it to the highways, I've been driven on both in the United States and here in Germany. They are full of potholes, and the Chinese highways, they are just wonderful. They're perfect, right? I mean, so infrastructure, and what they're also doing well is education, right? I mean,
Oh,
everybody
I've
is
heard
very
many good things
affordable.
about their education. Yes.
Exactly. It's open. The students are excellent, very, very hardworking, and very well educated. So these are all the things they're doing right. But you also asked about what's not going well, and there's things that are not going well. I mean, after 40 years of economic growth, China has hit a roadblock because, I mean, it's also normal, but it's also something to do with the situation in China. And there has been in some areas, for instance, especially in the property market, there has been overinvestment. Too much was built, too many houses, high-rise houses, too many, apartment buildings were built, and there's not enough people who can afford to buy them because they are very expensive. So you have a property crisis, you have falling real estate prices. That, of course, is a big problem. And you also have second point. China used to be, a low-cost country, LCC, low-cost country, but it's no longer a low-cost country. Shanghai is expensive, Beijing is expensive. Salaries are much higher than, let's say, in Vietnam, in Indonesia, and the Philippines. So also, of course, businesses are moving away from China now because they find other LCCs, low-cost countries in other parts of the world. So China faces some serious problems, yes.
What about the age, the median age, or I think that's getting scary, right? The average person is above 60 years old or 50 years old, or there's something that's happening there, probably based off of their one or two child rule that they implemented years ago. So there is something that's happening with the population that the average person is above a certain age that is kind of alarming. Is there anything that you can share in regards to that?
Absolutely. As you said, in 1980, China adopted the one-child policy, and it said, parents are only allowed to have one child, and it was absolute. It was implemented, one can say, throughout the country, and in fact, it led to a great decline in birth, and it is never recovered, really. And now the government, of course, has reversed the one-child policy since 2016. It's possible for parents to have three children, up to three children. But now the parents choose not to have children anymore because it's expensive and so on.
Right, right. The cost of childcare way higher, so it's actually more
Exactly.
alarming. Yeah,
Yeah.
interesting.
Exactly. So now they have the problem that, in fact, as you said, I mean, the age group above 60 or 65 is growing quickly. And we have about 150 million people, in that age group, in a very high age group, and another hundreds of millions coming into that retirement phase. And they, of course, have to save money because the government doesn't offer much help. So it's a huge problem, and that also means, however, if there are no young people, that also means there's less, domestic consumption. There is also less investment, and then also they have a labor shortage at some point, right? So it's a big problem for China, but it's a self-made problem, right? They have inflicted it upon themselves to a
Wow.
large degree because the one-child policy wasn't, nobody. So that was something that they came up with. But I believe in my book, in Making China Modern, I call it the greatest policy mistake in China since the 1980s.
Jeez. Now, was there a pressing issue in 1980 and that's why they needed to do it? Or was it just something that they did to prepare for a future that wasn't overcrowded? So, I mean, I don't know what was happening in 1980, but for them to enact that, that had to be so crazy to the average citizen. So, what was happening then and why did they enact that?
It was really a mistake. It was a calculation that was based on false assumptions. So the belief was that if China's population would continue to grow, then it would eat up all the economic development and prosperity. But the fact is, already in 1980, the population was already declining because people were getting better educated, the economy was improving, and once the economy improved, it's the fact that a lot of people choose then because if they can, if they can save enough money for their retirement, they don't have to rely on children. So what we see in the entire world is the more prosperous a society gets, right? The less children they have, usually. And
Wow.
so that has something to do with it. And so that was already happening in China, but nonetheless, they made that wasn't fast enough for them. So it was really a mistake.
Wow. I want to look into that too, because that what you just said is extremely fascinating. The more prosperous a nation gets, the less likely they will have children simply because they're self-sustainable, like you said. And if they have certain things to pursue and build and enjoy, maybe there's less focus to have on kids. That's interesting. I gotta look that up.
Yeah.
Um,
Mhm.
one thing that I know that China's working on is obviously BRICS. This is the thing that we talk a lot about in our groups. So I would love for you to share any type of insight that you have. So looking at the BRICS nations, I think the original what was it, the original five? I think that's 40%. If they adopted the BRICS currency, that's 40% of the population in the world. And I believe more and more countries are joining consistently. And I think they're aiming to have over 40 countries adopting the BRICS within the next couple of years. So whenever it tips over 51% or whenever it tips over 60, 70%, it's game over. It's going to crush the dollar, in my opinion. And I think that's part of the strategy. You have people like Xi Jinping, you have people like Putin, not too big of fans of the United States. This would be the ultimate chess move. This would be the gavel hitting the bench, and it would be a total victory. So is there anything
Yeah.
you could share with us in regards to BRICS and what you know about it?
Well, certainly, my pleasure. So China, as you already said, I mean, is a big believer in the BRICS and is one of the most, let's say, active supporters of that group. But we need to ask why is that, right? And China, of course, like all the other members of in the BRIC groups, have the feeling that they are too dependent or too reliant on the West, let's say Europe and the United States. And I think a key moment in this is actually the 2008 financial crisis that started in the United States. This had this sent shockwaves around the globe. And I think we often underestimate in the West that that is a really turning point for the non-Western world because they were affected by something that they didn't cause and they couldn't influence it. So it started in the United States. The real estate sector collapsed, banks collapsed, and it sent waves through the entire financial system of the world. And from that is the moment where a lot of these countries in the rest of the world started to think, how can we become less dependent? And that is actually when these movements, such as BRICS, really gained momentum and they started to grow. But I think second point to that, right? China is important in this, but also the BRICS is very diverse. You have countries such as Brazil and China and Russia and all the others, and they have there's very different commonality. They only share one wish to become less dependent from the dollar and
Right.
therefore less dependent from the American Central, Federal Reserve and so on and so forth. But that's the only thing that they have in common. other than that, they don't have a political ideology. They don't have, they have very different cultural backgrounds. They have very different political systems. They are poor, they are strong, they are backward, they're advanced. So I would say if we in the West or in the United States try to reach out more or consider more or be, with certain areas in the world, it would be easy, to have a bigger say or influence.
Yeah, I'm with you. And so, are you alarmed that we are on the brink of a World War III? And in my opinion, a World War III, the only reason why they would even do it is to topple the US dollar and to change the structure, the hierarchy, right? The less that they are dependent on the Federal Reserve. I mean, they're printing money like crazy. It's almost like fake money at this point where they are knowing that something is going to happen. So I think that if you hear anything in the news about Ukraine and whether what's happening with Taiwan and all that, I believe all of it, the underlying tone, the underlying reason is to shift all of the chessboard pieces in place. So this is the end result, the changing of the guard, if you will. Do you agree with me, or are you alarmed in any way that like I am?
I'm worried about the future, and we see the growing tensions, and that's clear. As I said, I believe that China and other countries want to be want to what how can I say that, want to be less dependent on the US and other countries. And I think to a large extent, as I said, after 2008, that seems understandable to me. I'm not sure if they want to topple the system, because if you want to topple the current, let's say, global economic system, in which the United States, of course, is very important, you would have to have something to replace it with. And I don't see that they have. So it's easy to topple something, but what do you do then, right? And so that's the big question. Uh, but I think we are in a dangerous spot where we see this growing tensions, and I think we don't have enough dialogue or have enough policy process that would allow us actually to come up with a solution. So there are these tensions, there is huge transformations underway, but we do not know where it will end up. And I feel we have nobody in charge, who's actually, saying, because I mean, the United States in a way is also becoming more inward. Europe also is becoming more inward looking, so we are more and more occupied with ourselves.
Yep.
But who is actually in charge of global affairs? And I don't see anybody, and that's not a good situation.
Interesting. Um, Social credit score. This is the one thing that is very scary to me. And if it comes from, I know China has adopted it quite quickly, and I can only see it migrating over the United States in time. So, what do you know about it? Is there any pushback? Can they push back, or is it scarier than I even realize? I mean, with AI, what I realize about China is they adopt technology faster than most people, most countries. And so, with social credit score, it's the ultimate way of control. And with AI, and I'm reading about AI daily, it is getting so crazy, so scary, so fast that I don't know if the world is ready for it. So, what do you know about that?
It is a scary thing, and not only is it you and me are scared, but also many people in China are scared. And now the good thing, I don't know if that's a good thing, but anyway, the observation is that China hasn't been as successful in implementing it as they themselves believed, I think, and as also the West believed. So right now, when I was in China, my last trip was in January, so 3 months ago. And actually, you don't see anything. You don't see the credit score system. And it has not really been, and I also read articles about it. I mean, it's still on the drawing board in many places. And in fact, in many things, they have actually rescinded it. So for instance, you used to be only to be able to buy a train ticket if you had a good score, social credit score. But that, for instance, is not being implemented anymore. So they have withdrawn it. And I think that it has something to do with that a lot of people in China didn't like it either. And there has been building up criticism. So I wouldn't, however, say that we can completely forget about it now. It's
Yeah.
still on the table. We need to observe it. Right now, it's not as scary as it looked years ago. But it's also, but it can also mean that they are right now just combining it with AI, as you said, and it becomes much more horrendous, than we used to think.
Yeah, I was just watching a video the other day of an individual who was using a simple program about and it's basically the lead up to potentially military use, but this program will always track a person's forehead, right? So if there was any type of reason for assassination or any type of military use, these AI bots, these AI machines that are pretty easy to create nowadays, they don't miss, right? So if anybody walks out of their house, or I mean, even inside their house, there is no privacy at all. And you are completely at the mercy of technology, which is very much like the movie Terminator, Terminator 2. So
Yeah.
it's getting more and more lifelike, and it is pretty wild. So China
Yeah.
is at the forefront of it all. I know that.
Yeah. And even if somebody else told me recently that if you use satellites are now so good, that you can also use that to track people. So we are at a point where technology becomes so powerful that one really needs is reminded of the movies that you just mentioned. Yeah.
So, if somebody picks up your book, guys, the book is called Making China Modern. What is the ultimate takeaway? Is there one, two, or three takeaways that you could share that maybe there's something that you learn that is pretty inspiring, or certain things that maybe what not to do? I've always analyzed great entrepreneurs, and there's always something you can learn from them and something you can take away and say, I'm never going to do that. And that's sort of the golden rule. So, what would be the ultimate takeaway?
So the ultimate takeaway of the book is that I wanted to show that what made China successful, right? And we discussed this briefly. So the pragmatism, the experiments that China adopted that are really, sort of the secret of its success. So I wanted to show what made China successful. So if somebody wants to understand, how to actually lead a country out of poverty into prosperity, that would be, I think he will find the answers in this book. But I also point out that there are many unresolved issues that we also briefly touched upon, such as, for instance, technology, control, the political system. So the big takeaway is a picture of a country that is enormously successful, but also has some unresolved issues ahead of.
Mm. And you travel to China quite frequently, it sounds like. From what I gathered from even people who go to Russia and to China, extremely clean. Is that right? Where it is very different than certain cities in the United States. So is there something that's going on there? Once again, if there's no crime and there's major punishments for either littering or destroying of property, most people are going to stay away from that. So it's an extremely clean city slash country. Am I right?
It has become very clean. The big cities have become very clean, but the countryside, not always. It depends, because there's also, especially in the countryside, there's still a lot of pollution going on, different sorts of pollution, but it's not, but the cities are very clean.
Got it. Got it. Okay. Making China modern from the great, and I always say Xing, but it's
Qing, from
Xing,
the
Xing,
great Qing,
Xing
yeah,
to the Xi Jinping. So,
yes.
guys, pick up his book. By the way, doing really well. 4.5 stars, average star rating. Almost 100 reviews on Amazon. Doing really well. It came out in November of 2020. Wow, was that a wild time, huh? Just that
Yes.
was a wild time of American history. I know that. So, guys,
Yeah.
look him up, and you're easy to find on LinkedIn. I know that. So, where else can people find you? A website, social media, anything you recommend?
Social media, I'm on LinkedIn. I'm also on X and everything. And yeah, and I have a website for the book. It's called makingchinamodern.com.
Beautiful. All righty. And so you are the president of Zeppelin University. I'm assuming your schedule is booked today, so I'm going to let you go. But I can't thank you enough. Fascinating stuff, guys. Learn what's going on in other countries, and you can probably see what's coming our way and how to maybe adjust and create that dream life even though there's chaos everywhere. So where there's chaos, there's opportunity. And remember, $1 million book will lead to $1 million life. Right on.
Thank you so much.